morning, Emma, and thank you so much for joining me this morning in conversation. I'm Rachel Riggs, I'm the chair of the Broxtowe Women's Project, and we're excited to have a series of conversations really with people like yourself ahead of International Women's Day, and in particular the choosing to challenge around domestic abuse. So I've got a few quite meaty questions to kind of run through with you this morning, so I'm going to kick off, if that's all right, in relation to your position coming in as Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for Nottinghamshire. How has that been over the last few months, and in particular in such a challenging time?
So I started as Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner in July last year, which means that for the entirety that I've been in post, it's all been, online. It's been impacted by COVID, and so that's been really challenging. I think having the opportunity to meet with services, to meet with stakeholders, to meet with community groups, that's all been really quite limited to being behind a screen. And there's a lot of people now who I work with, and I've never met them in real life. So that's something that I found really challenging. But it's also a really crucial time to be in this role. Paddy appointed me, asked me to take a lead on our work with victims, but also to lead particularly in our work with survivors of sexual violence and domestic abuse. And whether that's through COVID, whether that's through the domestic abuse bill, I think it's a really important and significant time to come into that role. So in that sense, I'm really enjoying the challenge.
Yes, it's, I think just looking specifically at the COVID stats, I think is it every 30 seconds in the first 7 weeks of lockdown, there was a call to the police regarding domestic abuse in one shape or form or another. And I think, it's true to say that we as a charity have noticed how much more difficult it is for victims to be able to escape that, with those additional restrictions. And I think BWP, like many community support agencies, have seen such an increase in the demand for their services. And obviously one big piece of legislation that we're hoping is in that final stage, really, the domestic abuse bill. We're hoping it's going to bring quite a few significant changes. How do you see that unfolding over the next few months and years, and in particular in relation to, dealing with some of those additional demands?
I think that just to talk about the domestic abuse bill to start with, you're right that this is a really significant piece of legislation. It's actually the first time that in legislation we will have a definition of what domestic abuse actually is. And I think that's so important. We know that domestic abuse is quite misunderstood still, although there's been a lot of improvements that have been made around it. How do you understand what is not defined? So therefore, having that statutory definition is really, really critical. But there's also some other really positive things which are within the bill, whether that's the creation of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, the statutory duty for local authorities around accommodation services. There's parts of it which mean that it will no longer be possible for perpetrators to cross-examine survivors in civil law or family courts, and all of that is really crucial and really important. But what would really take this bill from being a significant bill to being a landmark bill is for the government to support some of the amendments which have been put forward to it, which are being considered at the moment. Whether it's extending the statutory definition, the statutory duty beyond accommodation services to include community services, that's really important. Whether it's about understanding that control can take place post-separation, recognising the need for non-fatal strangulation to be recognised as an offence on its own, as opposed to just being classed as assault, but also around migrant women with no recourse to public funds. So it cannot be right that in 2021, that someone based on their immigration status can be trapped in an abusive relationship with no help available to them through services. That is just not right. and the government has the opportunity to do something about that right now, and I would really urge them to take that up. But you also mentioned about, you know, how do we take this going forward as well? What's so important is that, you know, this is, as I said, important legislation, but what we don't want is for this to be legislation which is just sat gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. This needs to be legislation that is driven forward, and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner will play a really important role in that. But also the government needs to put its money where its mouth is and actually make sure that this is funded going forward.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the key role of the DA Commissioner. Do you see that as being particularly significant in kind of that element really of overseeing all of those actually coming into practice?
Absolutely. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner role is a really important one, and the government, although the bill's not been passed, which actually kind of puts that in place, we've currently got a designate Domestic Abuse Commissioner in Nicole Jacobs. She's got an absolute wealth of experience within the sector, from the front line to managerial roles to strategic roles. So she comes with that real deep understanding of the issues that are involved here. And she won some brownie points with me. I invited her very early on to come to Nottinghamshire to hear about some of the good work going on here, and she was good enough to come, and committed to coming again to meet with more of our services as well. But the role of the Commissioner, as he said, is about holding the government to account. And I think so far she's been really strong on that. She's been campaigning around particular amendments for the domestic abuse bill already, which has been important. It's also, though, about mapping services that exist at the moment, which might not sound especially glamorous, but, you know, if we don't map our services, if we don't know what exists at the moment, how are we going to put kind of credible bids for funding to the Treasury for more if we don't know what there is at the moment? But also it's about sharing best practice. And yeah, as I said, she's been here, she's heard about great things that are done here. I'm sure that next time she comes, she'll be telling us about things that are going on elsewhere, and similar, she'll be telling elsewhere about what's happening in Nottinghamshire, which is so important. And also just around campaigning on the issue of domestic abuse. You know, domestic abuse, as to be understood, has come on such a journey, and people have much better understanding now than they had historically. But it is still really misunderstood. There is still so much that we need to do in terms of education with our young people, with society in general. And she's in a really strong position to be able to do that. So I'm really excited about the role that she's taken up and what might come with it.
That's really exciting to hear, actually, you know, because it is such a significant chapter ahead, isn't it? So that's really key. And I think you mentioned, you know, that the education and the messaging, and this campaign in itself is really about that raising awareness, isn't it? And allowing voices to be heard. Because I think the key that is throughout all of what we're dealing with here is that it's the being so isolated or not being able to actually access help. What do you think some of those barriers still are, really, in terms of getting access to that protection or those reporting mechanisms, and particularly here in Nottinghamshire?
I think a big issue remains, as I've mentioned, that understanding of what domestic abuse actually is and what it looks like. You know, it is not just physical. It is not just people being subjected to physical violence. It is much more than that. It is that psychological control, that coercive control, economic abuse, the emotional abuse. You know, there is so much there when you unpack it. And I think that there is still, I think, a fear amongst survivors that they won't be believed, or that you know, that they won't be understood in what they're experiencing. And I think that understanding of domestic abuse, and through campaigns such as this, we're able to increase that will encourage people to come forward. But we also know that there are particular communities who are underrepresented at the moment in terms of accessing help and support, whether that's the LGBT community, male survivors, Black and other ethnic minority groups are currently underrepresented. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there in terms of building trust with these communities. You know, they're not one monolithic community, to be really clear, but in some cases they are not necessarily those who might access help through public bodies, through public authorities, through the police, through all of these organisations. And so I think there is a big piece of work going forward in terms of building that trust, building that dialogue, so that they can feel that they can access help when they need it.
And I think quite a lot of that is very much reflected, isn't it, in the PCC plan. You know, talk about improving those local responses and working in partnership. And I think we touched on it earlier, but one of the whole concerns, isn't it, is about securing that vital funding, because there has to be that universal approach and access point across both commissioned and community-based services. Do you see that as one of those major sort of commitments for Nottinghamshire in securing that?
I think that secure, stable funding is something that is sorely needed from the government at the moment. I think that, you know, we talked about kind of the statutory response for accommodation-based services, which is within the bill. And, you know, there's real challenges with that if the government don't seek to extend it to community-based services as well. Because what we'll see is, you know, that they're both receiving funding at the moment, let's say, of an equal amount. If there's a statutory duty placed on one and not the other, you don't get more money to it. You potentially are just channeling more to one than the other, and so inevitably you're taking away from one to feed the other. So that's why it's really important that that's extended to the two, so that the two don't lose out. But the other thing that I would say is that the government needs to take a much more strategic, long-term view when it comes to domestic abuse. That the funding that is received, and I think that this was really telling with the money that came through from the COVID funding, is that there's always strings attached. It had to be spent by such and such a date. It can only be spent on these things. It can't be spent on these things. And I just think that fundamentally, those services who are working day in, day out with survivors, supporting them, know far better what those survivors need than government ministers do. And so going forward, I think government ministers need to trust services to know what's best for domestic abuse survivors and how to best support them.
Absolutely. Just as we bring our conversation to a close, Emma, because there's just so much we could carry on unpacking, but conscious of time, we talk about the choose to challenge. This is a huge challenge, isn't it? And this particular bit of this campaign is around that raising awareness and standing up and saying, you know, I choose to challenge. Personally, I think one of the things I've embraced on that is challenging the stigma around domestic abuse. As you've said, it comes in so many different shapes and forms, and often it's met, or people fear it will be met with that sort of cynicism, or the sense that actually it's something you can do something about. So I personally will be choosing to challenge that in my day-to-day life and dealings with people I come into contact with. Would you have a specific challenge that you would choose in that regard, either personally or in this role?
I think to really bring back to the start of what I was saying is that my challenge is to the government, that there is an opportunity here with the domestic abuse bill to make real life-changing decisions and opportunities for domestic abuse survivors. I would urge and I would challenge them to take that opportunity to make the maximum difference for those who are suffering.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Emma, and thank you for all you're doing, and in such a short space of time, clearly make major inroads, and I'm sure and confident you're going to carry on doing that for everyone in Nottinghamshire. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm really grateful for the Broxtowe Women's Project for all the work that they do and for inviting me along today.